Well, let me punt this off. How is it that we're referred to as, that we've named ourselves Thomas Aquinas College rather than, say, St. Thomas Aquinas College? May I ask Dr. Neumayr that question?
Well, yes. The answer to that is fairly simple. We thought we might begin at Dominican College, college for women in Marin County, but they were interested at the time we were beginning in going co-ed in some way. Most of the schools around the country had, and they felt left behind. So they took an interest in our proposition and even said that there would be property on their campus, and they have a beautiful campus incidentally, but property on their campus where we might build our own college, our own building. And so I guess to give some kind of habitation to an idea, some kind of local existence to it, we had to give it a name. And it was the practice of the sisters there to name all of their buildings after Dominicans, but not use the title saint. And therefore, we were quite willing to use St. Thomas Aquinas at the time, but to fall in line with their practice, we dropped the saint and simply Thomas Aquinas. Isn't that right?
You're right.
Yeah, I think so.
Do I actually have to call
Let
them?
me add one thing. And then when we incorporated, you know more about this than I do. When we incorporated in the state of California, we incorporated under the name Thomas Aquinas. Remember, isn't that right? Mm-hmm. Yeah, when we incorporated, and therefore, when we left Dominican College and we're on our own, then we kept the same name. It would have meant going to the state, renaming the corporation. And we thought as long as the corporation had one name, and we started to get a few inroads into people who might be interested in the college, we thought it was best to keep the same name.
I think, if I could just add, I think one other consideration was that there were a lot of colleges in the country named for St. Thomas, and we needed to try to find some way to distinguish in our own, what our own name was from the others. There were Aquinas colleges, Aquinas universities, St. Thomas colleges, so on. So.
Hi, Dr. McArthur, Dr. Neumayr, Mr. DeLuca. Over here at your left.
Oh, there you are.
I was blessed to be in the third graduating class at the Calvus campus, in case you can't remember. I heard a story once from one of you, I won't say which one, about when you got interested in philosophy and becoming a student of philosophy, a lover of truth. And to inspire many of us who are raising kids, hoping their children will become lovers of truth and philosophy instead of video games or whatever. Because I know one was a basketball player, one loved tennis, things like that in your past that seem to take a love in your life more than philosophy. I'd love to hear the stories of how each of you became a desire, a searcher of truth, and then a philosophy teacher.
You answer.
You want me to start answering?
Go ahead.
Yeah. First of all, I want to say that since we're kind of on the spot and accused of having done something, the nature of which we're not sure, I would like to reserve the right to cite the Fifth Amendment, except that I've learned that the constitutional amendments have no particular significance. So I won't bother with that. I think in many ways I took an interest in philosophy because I had gone to St. Ignatius High School, and I was a basketball player, and I had a basketball teammate, classmate, Cappy Lavin was his name, and infamous character in San Francisco, it turns out, but a poetic man who was interested in ideas as well as basketball, but interested in ideas And we would often go off to Golden Gate Park, which is near the old St. Ignatius High School grounds, for lunch and observe the fauna and the flora and talk about ideas. And he was already reading T.S. Eliot, I remember, and also the Thomas Wolfe, Look Homeward Angel, and he's very advanced in those things. And so we spent a lot of time talking about ideas. And I must have been thinking about these things myself well before this, but it sort of came to the surface. And so when I went on to Notre Dame and then took a philosophy course, I was kind of surprised to find that the things we were talking about, especially doing Plato, were things that Cappy Lavin and I had talked about in Golden Gate Park, not knowing what in the world you'd call them, but they were just ideas. So I suppose that's where things began with me. And then as I went on studying more and more, I realized that the studies that were offered in college, of them, I thought philosophy was by far the most interesting. And so I stayed with that and then went on in graduate school at Notre Dame in philosophy as well. And eventually, through the influence of Ron McArthur and others, I would say, but I went on to Laval and studied philosophy under Charles de Koninck and Monsignor Dion and the other professors there. So, yes, so as well as I can tell, that's where philosophy begins. I was reading something, though, in the paper about how genes are so important, much more important than environment. They have had studies with twins that have grown up apart from each other, and when they grow up, they have the same ideas, the same habits, the same customs. They dress the same. They have dogs they give them the same names, and all kinds of things. So I don't know. Maybe it really began somewhere in your bones, though. As Aristotle observes in the beginning of the Metaphysics, that all men by nature desire to know, and the thrust of that desire is finally philosophical. They want to know the means to ends for practical things indeed, but it's the intellect that wants to know those means, that wants to perfect itself in knowing, in learning, and finally in wisdom. So I suppose just being a human being and not forced into something else, I suppose, the natural inclination was to turn to the philosophical things.
Should I comment too?
Yeah, go ahead.
In my own case, I tried mightily as a young person to be a good tennis player. I was an adequate tennis player, but not a good tennis player. And therefore, I wasted my life pursuing things of absolutely useless, a waste of time. Then I went in the Army, and I came back from the Army, and I went to high school, and I graduated from a secular high school. I had never read a book all the way through, not a single book, and had no interest whatsoever in the intellectual life. I remember being in the Philippines, and there was an edition of Time magazine for the military with no ads, but it was the same as the Time magazine. So I would go to a tent in which they had books and periodicals, and I got out Time magazine. I couldn't read it because I didn't have a good enough vocabulary, so I didn't know what it meant. But I stayed with it for a while, and but didn't understand really anything there. Then I came back, and the question was, what was I going to do? And somebody in the Army said, an older man in the Army said to me, "You know," he said, "you got a big mouth." And he said, I think you'd probably make a living as a lawyer. So I thought, listen, you have to do something. I know I'm going to have to do something. That sounds okay to me. And so then the question was where to go to college. And I applied to Santa Clara, and I could be taken there, but I would have to wait a year because all the returning Santa Clarans were going to go back to Santa Clara, and was accepted, but I would have to wait a year to go there. So I'm talking to my friend on the street corner who had gone to St. Mary's from high school, and he said to me, listen, St. Mary's is not a bad place. You might like it. There are a couple of teachers there I think are quite good. And so why don't you go out and talk with them? So I said, sounds good to me. So I went out and talked to them and gave them my transcripts and etc. By that time, I'd had a year of college in the Army because they had an officers program in the Army which they cashiered. Because the war was starting to come to an end, they didn't need any more officers. So I gave them my high school transcript. I gave them that transcript. And I was accepted at St. Mary's. And so that's how I went to St. Mary's College. Then at St. Mary's College, we had to read the original text in the seminars. And when I started to read those texts, then that changed my life, literally changed my life. I said, this is the only thing I've ever read that makes sense. Maybe somebody can understand something, and maybe something can make sense. So that got me started in things philosophical. And given the students of St. Mary's, I guess I would be called outstanding in that place. And so I thought, well, maybe I can do this. And then Charles de Koenig came to St. Mary's on a lecture tour. And I listened to him at St. Mary's College. And I thought the lectures were just amazing. I remember a lecture in which he spoke about the fall of the angels in St. Augustine. And I remember listening to the lecture, and I thought to myself, does he actually know what he's talking about? Is that true? I was just amazed at the lecture. So then I talked with him, and through that talk with him, then I went to Laval after St. Mary's College. So that's how I got interested in things philosophical. Now, if I had been a really good tennis player, what would have happened? I don't know. As it ended up, my first job was at the San Francisco College for Women, where I taught Jack's sister and through his sister I met Jack. And Jack had never played tennis as a kid, so he was learning to play tennis older. That's almost impossible to do with tennis. Either you learn to play when you're very, very young, or you're not going to be very good. But he was a good athlete, so he became good. And so we used to go around in tennis courts. He used to come and his what kind of car did your dad have? What was
It was an Alfa Romeo or something like that.
Yeah, the Italian car.
Yeah.
So Jack used to come by, pick me up, and we used to go all around playing tennis and things like that.
Frankie
So,
Kovacs.
listen, maybe if we had both been better at tennis, I don't know what would have happened. But anyhow, I guess I was the second person to probably talk with you about some intellectual things. Is that right? After Cappy Lamon?
Maybe after Cappy Lamon, yeah. No, I met a few at Notre Dame
Yeah.
and so on, but
Yeah.
but yes, I think we started in terms of a career in teaching. I think it was probably our conversations that were most
Yeah.
formative there.
Yeah. So that's how I got interested in philosophical things. And then we met Pete DeLuca, and our lives changed in many, many ways. So I want him to speak to you about those things because he has some real insights into what he's about and and what you beat us into.
Oh, go on. Well, the way my introduction to the intellectual life was completely accidental. I went to a small Catholic high school in San Pedro, and one college sent a recruiter there, was St. Mary's. And so several of us went to college there because that was the only college that seemed interested, really for no other reason. And that's where my intellectual awakening occurred. I had a lot of good teachers there, particularly Ron McArthur, and Brother Edmund Dolan, and Dwayne Berquist, all of whom I learned a lot from. And they were the ones who awakened my interest in the intellectual life. And so I had an experience somewhat parallel to that, which a lot of you had coming here.
Here's a story. This is a true story. When Pete graduated from St. Mary's, he went to work for the Intercollegiate Studies Institute, and he was going to change the world, change American education, with all these conservative folks who actually believed in God and some decent things, and he was going to work for those, and it was going to change the map of America. And I remember telling him, "You're not going to change the map of America with that stuff. You can't do it with that stuff." And he says, "Yeah, well, you'll see." About 3 years later, I met him. I said, "How you doing?" He said, "You can't change stuff. You can't change. You can't do it. You can't do it." Then he said to me, "We got to start a college." I said, "We got to start a college?" "Oh yeah, we got to start a college. Unless we have a college, it can't be done." And that's the first thing I heard about starting a college. Remember that? Yeah.
I believe it.
Do you remember that?
Vaguely, yes.
Was it true that even well before that, I think, when in those days when we were playing tennis together and waiting for a tennis court or something like that, tired afterwards, sitting down, we were always talking about the state of Catholic education.
Oh yeah.
And how it isn't what it might be, isn't what it should be. But half a loaf is better than none. There it was existing, and you weren't going to start a college when you'd never done it before. And in a time when colleges' liberal arts programs were failing left and right.
It's true.
And so we talked about it a lot. There was no doubt about that, but the idea of actually doing it was another story. Now, you know the story better than I do, Ron, so maybe you should tell it, but I've always been struck with the fact that you, I think the two of you, had been at a Philadelphia Society meeting and talking with Doyle Swain, right, who was a fundraiser for Pepperdine, and a member of the Church of Christ, like Abilene Christian. But he had always admired Catholic education, the Catholic intellectual tradition. And I think at that time, when the teach-ins were starting, the protests against the Vietnam War and so on were starting, and Mario Savio was demonstrating over in Berkeley and arguing that you should trust nobody over 30, and people were throwing out their books more than 30 years old out of the libraries and so on. There was that we were talking about what was happening at St. Mary's, and they were kind of going in that same direction, and that it didn't look good. And then he asked, well, what would you do if you had your druthers, if you had your choice? What would you do about education? And then I guess you two spelled out pretty much the things that you've been talking about. Is that right? And at some point, and listening to that, he said, well, why don't you start your own college?
To which Ron said, "You can't start a college."
Yeah.
Well, I was thinking of you when I said that.
Well,
I was just sitting in the corner.
but naturally, the objections were there. We don't know anything about starting colleges. He was going to do that, and they seem to be collapsing at this time. And didn't he say something like this, that I know people that contribute money to Pepperdine who would believe much more in the education you're proposing than anything we could ever do at Pepperdine, and I'll put you in touch with some of them. And I think that kind of emboldened us to think, well, maybe we should go ahead. So then things followed up upon that.
I think that all happened just as you tell it, Jack.
Okay.
Yeah, Doyle Swain was someone who I had given him a copy of a pamphlet that had been produced for the integrated program for the soon to be revised and improved integrated program at St. Mary's, and it was something much along the lines of what we ultimately did here. And so he was anxious to meet Ron and talk to him at that meeting, and that was so I introduced them, and then caught up with them later in the evening, and they were already in the middle of a conversation about the possible ways to bring that conception of education to reality. At least that's the way I recollect it. But these things all happened a long time ago.